Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be around the world. Welcome to this joint event sponsored by the LSE's School of Public Policy and the Global Commission on Drug Policy. The purpose of this event is to have a look at the state of drug policy around the world, to take stock of advances and progress, but also to take stock of remaining difficulties and challenges around the world. We are very, very lucky to have with us today 4 members of the Global Commission who also happen to be former heads of state or former heads of government in their countries. And we have very, very distinguished guests from several continents around the world. And without further ado, I am going to introduce each one of the 4. And let me start with Madam Ruth Dreifus, who was elected councillor in 1993 to the Federal Assembly of Switzerland. And in 1999, she became president of the Swiss Confederation. After her retirement from government, she chaired the WHO Commission on Public Health, Innovation, and Intellectual Property Rights, and co-chaired the high-level panel on access to medicines. Like her colleagues here today, she's a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which she chaired from 2016 until last year. Next is Madam Helen Clark. Welcome, Helen. Not the first time that she's joined us at an event at the LSE, and I hope it will not be the last. Helen Clark was the first woman elected as Prime Minister of New Zealand, serving 3 successive terms from 1999 to 2008. In 2009, after she left office, she became the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme and the chair of the United Nations Development Group. She was the first woman to hold both positions. And since 2020, she has been the chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. Next is President Kgalema Motlanthe, who was elected president of the Republic of South Africa in September 2008, a position that he held until May 2019. Subsequently, he was appointed by President Jacob Zuma of South Africa to serve as deputy president of the Republic, and he served in that position from May 2009 until May 2014. He now heads the Motlanthe Foundation, which he established when he left office, and of course, he's also a member of the Commission. Last, but certainly not least, is President Juan Manuel Santos from Colombia, a dear friend of the LSE, a graduate of the LSE, and a Nobel Peace Laureate. President Santos served as president of Colombia for 2 terms between 2010 and 2018, and he worked and succeeded at establishing a peace process that eventually led to a peace accord with FARC, a guerrilla movement active in Colombia since the 1960s. And for this tremendous achievement, he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016. So those are our very, very distinguished guests. Welcome, everyone. And let me just remind you what it is that we are here to talk about. It is now the year of 2021, and it's been 50 years since President Nixon in the United States declared war on drugs. That war on drugs today is widely viewed to have been a failure. Drugs have certainly not gone away, and the punitive and repressive approach to drugs has had many costly and unintended consequences. To begin with, public health efforts in many countries have been consistently destabilized by current drug policies. Economically, the illegal market for drugs, estimated somewhere between $400 and $650 billion a year, threatens development in many parts of the world. The high market value of drugs as a result of their being illegal, especially in countries with few other economic opportunities, feeds mass incarcerations. And today, 1 in 5 of the nearly 11 million inmates around the world is incarcerated for a drug offense. And of course, drugs finance violence, threaten stability and democracy in many regions of the world. So in this discussion today with the commissioners of the Global Commission on Drug Policy created 10 years ago, we want to stimulate debate and help move toward reform around the world. Today we see some progress with the implementation of, for instance, policies that are evidence-based. Some countries are moving toward decriminalization and legal regulation, but in some countries we also see setbacks, greater repression, state-condoned judicial killings, and other human rights violations. So we're hoping that each one of our guests today can share their views of where it is all going, maybe draw a picture of the current state of drug policy and drug challenges around the world, and if possible, focus on the challenges in their respective regions. So I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to maybe spend 10 minutes tackling some of these questions. Then we will have a round of questions and dialogue among the panelists and move to a Q&A with the public. So let me start with President Dreifuss. Madam President, the floor is yours. Thank you very much to you and to everyone else.
Well, I think, yeah, I can speak and be heard. Yes, you are absolutely right in your description of the situation. We have a kind of, I would say, an ocean of repression and prohibition and traditional drug policy centered really on prohibition. And on the other side, since perhaps 40 years now in some countries, but mainly during the last decade, we have reforms on the ground, on national level, which are very, very important. For instance, the concept of harm reduction is something new. What is new is that it was adopted largely and that it helped to create measures to protect the life and the health of the people consuming drugs. And this not only in Europe. Europe might be a pioneer in this field, but Asia, Africa, North America are really developing also this kind of measures. And when I speak about harm reduction, just to be very clear, I speak about all what helps people who are consuming drugs to do so with as few harms as possible. Exchanging syringes, making safe injection or consumption rooms, allowing drug checking, for instance, so that people who buy on the black market knows what it is in it. And we have also new kind of treatment and a very criticism that has shown that constrained treatment are not those who can bring really people to abstain, for instance, for consumption. We have models of decriminalization, mainly in Europe, but also in other countries, at least the discussion about the disproportion of punishment for small-scale delinquent in Americas, in Africa, in many countries. We have new models of controlled markets, mainly on cannabis, but not only. So what I want to stress here is that it is not just Western-centric. It's not just for the countries who are at a higher level of economic development, but it is worldwide in some countries and others that such reforms are being made. But as I said, these reforms are generally pragmatic. They try just to mitigate also the errors and the harms caused by the policies. And you know, our member, late Kofi Annan, said several times that drug may harm people, but bad policy has harmed much more. And I think I can really leave to my colleagues to show how this harm caused by failed policies are impacting really the people of the world, not only the consumers, but all the environment in which drug consumption, drug trafficking, and so has an influence. So this is called now for 30 years in the UN system, it is called as unintended consequences. But these unintended consequences, we know now what they are, and they have to be really directly addressed. Harm reduction and the reform we see are generally not more than just mitigating the harms of this policy. Thank you for your attention, and I think we can make a whole catalog of harms caused by prohibition.
Thank you, former President Dreifuss, for that very good summary of where we are. Let me move on now, if I may, to former Prime Minister Clark. Helen, floor is yours, and again, welcome.
Well, thank you, Andrés, and greetings to fellow commissioners and to all who've tuned in for the session. Perhaps just moving on from the last points that Ruth was making, the Global Commission has had a lot to say about the failed international framework for drug policy and regulation, which is, of course, premised on a prohibitionist approach. It's an abject failure, even by the goals it set for itself. The 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs called for the elimination of the drugs scheduled under it. So the objective for heroin, for example, was for heroin to have disappeared from the world by 1979, and cocaine and cannabis were to have followed suit by 1989. Well, we know the results. Not only are they still around and far from disappearing, production and consumption of them hits new records almost yearly across the last decade. Yet amazingly, this quite unrealistic and counterproductive international framework stands essentially unchanged all these decades. I say counterproductive because the futile and repressive attempts to stop drug use, which have followed from the convention, have had profound impacts on health, well-being, and whole societies. For example, HIV and hepatitis are common among people who inject and use drugs in unsafe conditions, where little or no attempt is made to offer effective harm reduction measures. And in such circumstances, the drug-related death rate from overdose is also high. We see the prison musters blowing out, where penalties for using and possessing illicit drugs are severe. And then we see especially harsh punishments, often meted out to those convicted of drug offences, which, as you pointed out, are 1 in every 5 prisoners around our world. Take, for example, the judicial corporal punishment inflicted on drug offenders in Singapore, a form of torture. Barbaric, truly barbaric. You know, this is unique, repressive, horrible treatment that goes to such offenders. If we raised an example of the harms, which is close to home for the London School of Economics, look north to Scotland, where the drug overdose crisis there, for the last year we have figures, which is 2019, resulted in more than 1,264 deaths, double the number of 2014, just 5 years before. And Scotland has the worst rate of drug-related deaths in Europe. These are shocking and horrible figures. We saw the overdose crisis related to opioids in the United States, resulting in more than 81,000 deaths last year. We've seen the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines of people associated with drugs, costing thousands of lives. We've seen the war on drugs in Latin America associated with horrific rates of violent crime, including homicide, and of course, of forced displacement. So the position of the Commission is there simply has to be a better way. And countries which perceive that the international framework lacks all credibility are moving in a different direction, with more and more examples now of either legalization and regulation, decriminalization, and effective harm reduction measures. These approaches work within the reality that drug use will not be eliminated. So we need to think very carefully about policy so that we don't deny the right to health to those who use drugs. Thank you, Andrés.
Thank you, Helen. You put it very well, I think. There must be a better way out there, and I think coming up with that better way is one of the purposes, of course, of the Commission and of the meeting today. Let me move now, if I may, to President Motlanthe. Mr. President, floor is yours. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Andrés, and let me thank both Helen and Ruth for explaining and laying down the framework of the work of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. And I would like to start off by recalling that the objectives of elimination, when we really think of plants that are manipulated by people, are really not realistic. And that whereas the control regime, which started in 1912, was based primarily on the vision of social hygienism, and that today it's clear that regime is outdated because of the important lessons we gained in dealing with HIV epidemic that was linked to drug injection that has changed our. We now, from this experience of how we have to deal with HIV, patients need to be part of the response as partners. In HIV, people living with HIV carry the global response and promote access to treatment, prevention, and care. But on the other hand, when it comes to drug policy, people who are dependent on drugs, which means that they have serious physical and psychological dependency, are criminalized by law and are marginalized in society precisely because they are viewed as engaging in criminal activities. And so they are denied the requisite help from family members, from society, from community members, and so on. And then, of course, this is exacerbated by the disproportionate sentences meted out to those who are deemed to have engaged in criminal activities. And so the situation has led to the sad but unnoticed effect that international communities target as part of the Millennium Development Goals to reduce by 50% HIV transmission by the year 2015 among people who inject drugs was completely missed. Research shows that it increased by 30% the HIV infections through drug injection. So one of the largest issues we face, as I said, is the heavy sentences and which burden the criminal justice system for people who are guilty of non-criminal offenses, basically, and the pressure of that prohibition puts on correctional services in many countries around the world. So we need debates around to ensure that we move away from the taboo around drug control, because you know, it's possible to take a leaf from the example of how HIV, you know, giving the lead as partners, drug users and criminalize them. Yeah, let me pause there for now.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you point out very well, I think the repressive approach has not yielded the kinds of results we can be proud of. President Santos, needless to say, your country has been very much at the center of this debate. Perhaps you can share your experiences and your reflections on the subject. And again, welcome once again to the LSA.
Thank you, Andrés, and hello to my fellow commissioners. As you just said, I come from a country that probably has suffered the most in this world war on drugs. Mm-hmm. And it's been a war that has been going on for 50 years, and a war that has not been won in 50 years. It's a war that has been lost. It's been a failure. And I have a personal conviction that comes out of a personal experience. As Minister of Defense and then President of Colombia, I was in charge of the policy against drug trafficking. And Colombia, as I said, probably the country that has suffered the most in this war, applied the rules of the game that the world established, the punitive approach. And we followed those rules and applied them with a lot of discipline and a lot of sacrifice. And I personally, as Minister of Defense, because in Colombia, the drug trafficking is considered a national security problem because of the implications that drug trafficking has in the whole of the country. The ministry is in charge of the war on drugs. And as minister, I had to, for example, spray the largest amount of hectares of coca crops in the history of Colombia and the history of the world, because Colombia is one of the few countries who used spraying against the cultivation of illegal drugs. I had to sign extraditions for the largest amount of citizens from a country outside the United States to the United States, more than 1,400 extraditions. I had to, and was in charge of destroying the coca crops, more hectares than any time in the world. And we seized, through different operations and with the help of intelligence from the US, from the UK, from different countries, more tons of drugs than ever. In the year when I left the presidency was almost 500 tons of drugs that we seized. However, I said, this is like riding a static bicycle. You pedal, you pedal, you pedal, and you don't advance. You look to the right, you look to the left, and you're at the same place. So that, for me, was an experience that convinced me that what we're doing was wrong. And all the collateral damages that have been mentioned here, we have it in Colombia. Just 2 weeks ago, our prosecutor general boasted that he had, in the last month, incarcerated 10,000 Colombians. But out of those 10,000 Colombians, almost 7,000 were because of drug-related crimes, and usually non-violent drug-related crimes. If in the world, 1 out of every 5 prisoners is in prison because of drugs, in Colombia, that figure is much higher. I'll give you a more recent and worrisome example. After the peace process, one of the main points of the peace process was for the FARC to help the government to substitute illegal crops for legal crops. Well, unfortunately, because of the demand and the business going on, the drug traffickers, in a way, came into the areas where the FARC was present before the peace process, before they gave up their arms and came into civil society. And right now is the main source of violence in Colombia. So we continue to be a victim of this very wrong approach. The same day, unfortunately, that in the United States, 3rd of November, 8 states voted to legalize the consumption of marijuana. In Colombia, that same day, the government pushed the Congress to reject a law that was trying to achieve exactly the same goal. Just last Friday, or last Saturday, probably the city that consumes more drugs in the whole world, New York, has legalized the consumption of marijuana. So what does this mean for a country like Colombia? That the money stays in stays in the United States, but the violence and all the collateral damage stays in Colombia. So that's why I am more and more convinced that what the Global Commission on Drugs is trying to achieve, that we have to push even further, try to be more effective. We're seeing a trend towards non-prohibition, which is, I think, the key aspect of the whole problem, the word prohibition. But we have to advance much faster, because we are seeing that the damages all around the world continue, and we have to try to convince more and more people that what we have been doing for the last 50 years simply doesn't work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. What I propose we do is maybe have a quick round of questions and dialogue, and please let us make it informal. So I'm going to pose a question to each one of you, but other panelists should feel free to intervene, comment, disagree. And I'm going to change the order of interventions. We could make it informal and fairly swift, and then we will open it up to Q&A with our audience, which is pretty large. We have nearly 200 people connected from very different parts of the world. Let me begin with Helen Clark. Helen, you ran the UNDP. Aside from a political leader, you're a development expert. Clearly, the way we have been fighting drugs has been detrimental to development, and the conflicts and the tensions between what is done on the drugs front and the need to promote development objectives, the Sustainable Development Goals and other such goals. That tension, that conflict is ever more evident. How do you see this evolving, and what would you suggest? We're a school of public policy. Many of our students aspire to become public servants and political leaders in their own countries. What are the lessons of this tension, and what can we do to make sure that drug policy does not get in the way of development policy?
Well, before there was the sustainable development paradigm, there was the human development paradigm. And human development objectives are clearly incorporated into the sustainable development goals. The way in which the war on drugs has been fought has very adversely affected the most marginalized among us in our societies. And so it's almost as if those who use drugs, or those who get caught up in the fabric of supply at that lower end of selling and curing, are treated as evil people, the very language of the drug conventions. And once you brand people and their activities as evil, almost anything goes. So the way this has been approached has exacerbated marginalization and inequity, and has really not, left a way for the people impacted like that to get out of this dilemma, because they are so branded by society. Now, this isn't right. I think increasingly, as we see around the world, this repressive approach is under question from policymakers who get it, that it's not paving the way to some kind of drug-free utopia. And let's remind ourselves that throughout human history, people have turned to substances which they might find pleasurable. Ask any of us who enjoy a glass of Chilean or New Zealand wine, or which offer them relief from their reality or from pain. Now, some of those substances fall on the legal side of the ledger, others on the illegal, without there being any scientific basis to that. And if there's no scientific basis to a policy of this kind, you really need to question it. So alcohol and tobacco, for example, while causing significant harm to many, are largely regulated and taxed in societies. But other drugs and those who use them are treated so differently. And this is really the paradigm which the Global Commission has challenged since it was founded. Now, my own country last year went through a debate around the legalization of cannabis. And there was actually quite a good piece of legislation drawn up. Unfortunately, the government, having put it up, didn't campaign for it, and it very, very narrowly failed. But the argument we made was very much one couched in sustainable development. And it was that if you could bring the illicit trade in cannabis out of the shadows and into a formal market, as we now see in the jurisdictions which have legalized, and we hear most about those in the United States, but of course there's Canada, there's Uruguay, Mexico is just being added to this formal legalization. What you do is enable economic development to come to a region where it's growing. You enable people to become law-abiding citizens who pay their taxes. You actually can transform communities through the process of legitimizing, and one sees some very, very powerful examples of this from places in states like Oregon, where quite poor communities, which have been illicit cultivators living in fear, really, were able to, come forward and people could earn an honest living. There's also the fact that if you follow this approach, you free up tremendous resources that the state literally throws down the drain in trying to repress. In New Zealand, the most common sound in a rural area was the police helicopters hovering overhead looking for the plots. I mean, pathetic waste of money. We waste money on incarcerating people for offences where, frankly, no harm has been done by anyone. So I just think whichever way you look at it, from a right to health approach, a right to development, a right to human development, creating sustainable livelihoods, in the case of cannabis, generating revenue for the state budget by taxing and regulating as you would with alcohol and tobacco. This was a no-brainer. And I think that's the kind of pragmatic approach we need to take to a drug like that. There are pragmatic approaches too with the other drugs, and Ruth Dreifus is definitely the best qualified among us to talk about how she dealt with what was called Needle Park in Zurich and its equivalents in Switzerland. The repression of those who injected drugs led to a health crisis. Ruth dealt with it in a decisive and pragmatic way. And that's the kind of thinking and reasoning we need. Don't marginalize people. Bring these issues into the open. Make people into honest citizens because you change the legal settings, and always put their health and their well-being and their potential at the forefront of your policy concerns.
Thank you, Madam Prime Minister. I'm going to turn to President Motlanthe, if I may, and ask a political question and also an international relations question. Some of the policies and some of the legislation needed to deal with drugs can be adopted and implemented at the national level. But of course, much of this is international. The demand often comes from overseas. There are many global and international spillovers. And as a leader of a developing country or an emerging nation, as is President Santos, sometimes we in the developing world feel that we are at the mercy of policies and decisions that are made at the other end of the world that we do not fully control or control in the least. So politically and internationally speaking, Mr. President, what is the right forum and what are the right political mechanisms to tackle these challenges? Should this be a matter for the multilateral system? Should we tackle it at a regional level? Is that an illusion, and do we need to focus mostly on national level policies? What is your take on this?
Well, as they say, organizations like human beings have an immune system. They tend to fight back and push back against new thinking. Mm-hmm. And so since our societies are underpinned by either religious beliefs or take their cue from those of us who are in the developing world, tend to take our cue from multilateral institutions because international aid is tied to the policies that are more popular in the developed world, and so the prohibition is what we simply embraced, and we follow that. But it is clear that at national level, we need to initiate debates on more, cost-effective harm reduction policies, rather than to direct the limited resources at our disposal towards this notion of war against drugs, because you get your criminal justice system, you get the police and on law enforcement units, you get the military deployed towards dealing with people who are end users. And so my take is that we need to have these discussions at the global level. We need to have these discussions at regional level. We need to have these debates at national level. In South Africa, for instance, we have experienced fairly recently the benefits of legalizing marijuana, and the terms where that it is available for medicinal use, and that citizens have a right to grow it in their own backyards, and for personal use it is no longer criminalized, and that has reduced the numbers of ordinary South Africans who would otherwise have been criminalized and ending up in overcrowded prisons and so on. So in a way, what I'm really saying is that we need this debate to be initiated at all levels, starting right from the national level to regional levels, and as well as international levels here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to turn to President Dreifuss and ask the same question, but looked at from the other side of the world. One possible reading of the current state of decision-making is that many of these decisions are made in developed countries, perhaps most prominently the US, but not exclusively the US. And some, not all, but many of the costs are borne by countries like South Africa or Colombia. So in terms of, just practical politics, what are the right fora and what are the right means of persuasion to move this agenda forward, thinking from the perspective of a leader of a developed country? And of course, Helen mentioned your experience with Needle Park in Zurich. If you want to tell us a bit about that, I think it'd be absolutely fascinating as well.
Well, thank you. I mean, let me begin perhaps with our experience of Switzerland, being very, very brief. For many, many years, the idea was a pure repressive idea, and it was to crush down the deal and the open consumption in the streets. I mean, to liberate the neighborhoods from the presence of dealers and consumers. And this was a real example of what we call the balloon effect, because if you try to liberate one neighborhood from this what was considered as a bad situation, it just moved to another neighborhood. So at one moment, the strategy was to push all the people, the consumers and the dealers, in one place. And this had two results. A very bad result, because the misery of the people in these places was great. The people just spent the whole day and the whole night there, being half of the time under the influence of the drug and half of the other time trying to find the drug and the syringes and so on. But it had also the good effect to show what the drug issue is really, that it is a health issue, that it is an issue of safety in the neighborhoods, that it is an issue of families suffering from the drug addiction, for instance, from somebody. It was also the possibility to show that there is addiction. Some of these substances are addictive in a strong way, as tobacco is also, but others came just to the supermarket and had a controlled consumption. So we learned a lot through the open scenes, but we had really to finish this situation where people were just abandoned there. So from the bottom up, it was a movement to go in the scenes and to help the people. And this was the beginning of the development of the harm reduction, health-oriented harm reduction measures. What we learned also is that the focus on repression is just an obstacle to tackle with the issue. It is just focusing on one side, and this side is producing the country that was the aim, that is to stigmatize, as Helen said, marginalize, and put in great health harm the people who consume the drugs. So what I want to say is putting just the focus on repression had also as a consequence that we had no money to do the good things, to help the people and to develop health and social approaches. But what we learned was exactly that. We have to collaborate. All these different stakeholders, all these different groups, professional groups also have to collaborate to understand what the others are doing and not to jeopardize what one was doing. For instance, just to say, at the beginning, the police took the syringes as an evidence that somebody made a crime consuming drugs. It was important to explain that giving the syringes was an important path for health security, and that the police should be happy that the people have clean syringes. So bringing all these people together is absolutely key to make the reform on the ground. And now I come to your questions. Where should reform take place? On the national level, and often it is a movement that is coming from the ground, but have to be protected by the authorities and developed afterwards and financed by the authorities. Secondly, the regional approach is very important. I mean, the exchange of experience, the possibility to not to make twice the same errors in one country and the others. What is of concern is that on the international level, we have a straitjacket. The straitjacket, we have three straitjackets, the three conventions on narcotics. And there, in this discussion, it is very difficult to move forward. What is important are little steps to recognize harm reduction. It was a large battle to have just this word recognized as important, and now to decriminalize, to push all countries and to make it recognized on international level that criminalization of consumption is just a crime, I would say, to be very, very strong. So the discussion on the international level is important. Things are moving in the UN family, but they are not moving as fast as we would like to see it in Vienna, which is the main spot of these conventions. But we have to make one step after the other and show progress can be made, and the experience in the country and in the region show that the results are better.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me turn to President Santos and, if I may, stick with the theme of politics, but now move to domestic politics. In many countries, and certainly in your region of the world, Mr. President, which is also my region of the world, the political line of argumentation that relies on, repression, mano dura in Spanish, can be politically attractive. And of course, there are plenty of leaders that use it and use it for personal political gain. It may not be great for the country, but it can be good at times to gather a few votes. You've been very courageous in espousing a different approach. For the young future leaders listening in, share with us some of the lessons you've learned. How can a reform-minded liberal political leader make political headway in promoting reform, promoting the kinds of things that we've been talking about today, without falling prey to sort of anti-drug populism, which is ripe in so many places?
Thank you, Andrés. And let me just make reference to the previous question, because we had an experience where I am now convinced that we have to work at the three levels: international, regional, and national level. Remember in the year 2012, I had a conversation with President Obama. He had said in his campaign that we need a new approach on the war on drugs. And so I said, why don't we start discussing this issue at a regional level? And so we did. That was at the Summit of the Americas, year 2012. And we were able to table a resolution which was voted by all countries in the OAS to convene a special United Nations General Assembly to discuss this issue. It was convened. Ban Ki-moon convened the special session, and there we encountered the opposition of the Asian countries, Russia, and the Middle Eastern countries. So very little was advanced. And then we continued to try to make reforms at a national level. So one of the arguments was, as long as you don't change the international law, we cannot change our national laws because we would be violating international law. So it's a vicious circle. So we have to fight at every level. I think that it's only to illustrate an example for your previous answer. Previous question. Now, with the question you are telling me, and a message for any student is something that it happened in the peace process and it happens here in the war on drugs. Do what you think is right, not what you think is popular. It is very unpopular to fight, to go out to the street and say we need to legalize drugs, because it's very easy to do to make populism around this issue. I suffered it. When I started being president, my political opponents accused me of trying to poison the children in Colombia, of being a drug trafficker, of being a protector of everything bad. I remember going to meetings with the mothers of many children, and they shouted at me saying, "Why are you trying to poison our kids?" And so I asked them many times, "Why do you say that?" And they said, "Well, you are proposing to legalize drugs." And I said, that doesn't mean, like Helen Clark mentions so frequently, that doesn't mean that I am in favor of drug consumption. But I'll ask you this, Madam, whatever. If your son or your daughter is caught with drugs, would you prefer that your son or daughter would be sent to jail, or to an institution to help him or her to address this addiction. 99% said to an institution to address this addiction, this addiction. And I said, well, that's exactly what I'm proposing. And they all said, oh, why didn't you explain that better? So it is a very political issue, very easy to distort the facts, but we have to persevere and try to explain to people why prohibition is really the wrong way to approach this problem that is not going to disappear, but can be controlled. And I use an anecdote very frequently of a former prime minister from where you are, Andrés, Churchill, when he arrived to the United States during Prohibition. And he arrived through Canada to California. This anecdote is referred into one of the latest biographies by Andrew Roberts about Churchill. And he asked for a drink. And they said, no, Mr. Churchill, this is prohibited here in the United States. And he said, oh, what a strange country this is, referring to the United States during Prohibition. These fabulous profits that are made out of the sale of liquor, you're giving them to the mafias. In my country, we give it to the treasury. I think this encapsulates the approach from the violence point of view, not from the health, but you can add it also from the violence point of view. All the violence that we are seeing in Latin America, or most of the violence we're seeing in Latin America, certainly most of the violence in Central America and Colombia, but also in Brazil, and now in Argentina and Uruguay, the main source of this violence is drug trafficking. The mafias that are created around the drug trade that expand because they start with the drugs, and then they go to kidnapping, and then they go to extortion, and you go throughout the whole of Latin America, and you see the drugs as a transversal, very potent element in all the violence that we're going through. Certainly in Central America, you see all these, what they call the maras, these gangs, that there's also some tremendous contradictions. I remember telling President Trump, how can you expect the Central American countries and Mexico to fight drug trafficking when you just liberated the sale of arms to the gangs that are producing the drug trafficking? So there's a lot of hypocrisy in this discussion and a lot of political interest. But again, going back to the question, this is when you have arguments, and I think the truth is in our side, in the side of the commission or the ones who what we want to do away with prohibition, you need to persevere sooner or later. And I think we are advancing. As I mentioned before, I was pleasantly surprised last Saturday when New York, the #1 consumer city in the world, took the step of legalizing marijuana. I think we are advancing. We should advance more, and with good arguments and with the backing of the evidence and the science, which fortunately in this pandemic, again, it is again being respected. I think we will reach our port of destiny.
Thank you, Mr. President. So students, listen up. Good governance involves not necessarily doing what is popular, but doing what is right. And of course, if you stick with it, maybe what is right will become popular, or at least we keep hoping. Okay, I'm going to bring Professor Vanessa Rubio into the discussion. Vanessa, if you can turn on your camera. Vanessa is a professor of practice here at the School of Public Policy. She is a former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, of Social Development, and of Finance in Mexico, another country, of course, where these debates are red hot. So let me hand her over to you, Vanessa, and she has a couple of questions for our panelists.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you to the panelists for such a fascinating and quite illustrative dialogue. One thing that I've taught my students, actually we were on a workshop this Saturday, when we refer to the policy making different steps, is that you need to start with the proper definition of the problem. And this means also to have a proper definition of the objective that you want to achieve. And I think that most of your comments, in particular, one of Ms. Clark, was in reference to the fact that basically we had the objective wrong since the beginning, because the policy objective cannot be to eliminate drugs or to eliminate drug consumption. So my question to all of you, to any one of you that wants to add some thoughts about it, is in the points that we are now in the discussion, trying to bring this new narrative and this new approach to the international sphere, to the national sphere, what are the achievable objectives? What are the new objectives that we need to define in order for that to provide specific policy answers? And one comment by President Santos in particular, when he said that he spoke with President Obama in the Panama Summit of the Americas. I was actually at that summit as well, in the Mexican delegation, that President Obama wanted to have a discussion on a new approach to the war on drugs, but still is the war on drugs. So going 1 or 2 or 3 steps behind, I wanted to ask you, what are the new objectives that we can look forward to attaining? Thank you so much.
Who would like to take that up?
Well, I think the objectives are firstly around enhancing health and well-being. And if you marginalize those who use drugs, that has adverse effects on the young whose futures are blighted by arrest and conviction. And of course, in the worst cases can lead to incarceration, being caught up in a cycle of criminal violence, which may dominate their lives for a very long time. Also, with respect to the drugs which have the potential used unsafely to cause great harm to health to the point of death, our focus should be on preserving life, on enabling people who make this choice to use for whatever reason to be able to do so under conditions that are safe. And I think that's where courageous politicians like Ruth Dreifus were real pioneers in saying the fact that you are using heroin doesn't mean you should be condemned to a death sentence with unsafe needles and unsafe consumption. So I think the objective really is health and well-being, not marginalizing people who make a particular choice. And then also, the very real benefits of not over-incarcerating. Societies like New Zealand, the United States, the United Kingdom, there's quite a long, sad list, have prison numbers which are far too high. And given the high, rate of imprisonment for drug offending or drug-associated offending, tackling this issue from a more rational perspective would help with, stopping pressures on prisons and stopping locking people up for reasons that really don't hold water.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, Ruth, please.
With pleasure. Thank you, Andrés. What Helen was just saying are not really low-hanging fruits. But I mean, there are things we can reach, and some progress were made in this direction in the last decades, and I am sure other will come. And And this is something you can really also explain to the people, explain to the mothers. I made the same experience than Juan Manuel, but on another side, the mothers came to me and said, please help us because we are despaired. We don't know how to deal with our children, and you can perhaps help us because all what was offered until now has not worked. So I think we have to do all what Helen said, but the real objective is to take the whole chain of the drug business in responsible hands, in the hands of the state, linked with the development for the region that are now producing the drugs and often have no other real alternatives, I mean economic alternatives, the transportation and the retail business, if I can say so. This means also to decriminalize the consumption. But it is a business. Andrés, you spoke about how large the benefits of this business are and how they can corrupt institutions, how they can corrupt the functioning of the state, how they have a grip of population, of all neighborhoods, of some region of the world where they replace the state. And the state has to roll back the criminal organization. That means, and I will just finish with that the repression at the bottom of the pyramid is more or less without exit. I mean, it brings nothing but misery, incarceration, and so on. We have to collaborate better on the international level to tackle with the summit of the pyramid. That means corruption, that means money laundering, that means really international collaboration against multilateral and multinational crime organization. And perhaps also one thing that we in the Commission has discovered, if you make silos, for instance, one group in the UN, let's say, is in charge with repressing internationally the drug organization, criminal organization, but another is working on corruption, and another one is working on human trafficking, let's say. This is also a way not to be efficient because criminal organizations are businesses. They are very flexible. They are generally on multiple issues active. And if one is not as lucrative as hoped, because, for instance, of Caesar, they can swift to another. Juan Manuel spoke about the arms. I mean, it's just the same business often. The same people selling drugs in the US and bringing the arms back to their countries. So I would say this fight is very important. And the other mean to hurt really the criminal organization is to regulate the market. Take it in responsible hands, don't let it in criminal hands.
If I may, small correction, Vanessa. It was not in the summit in Panama, it was a summit in Cartagena in the year 2012. And very interesting, from that summit, a meeting before the OAS General Assembly in Guatemala, a meeting was convened in Panama. It was chaired by the director of the National Police in Colombia, who had been the hero against the war on drugs. And we brought in a Canadian who had helped Nelson Mandela in the peace process, called Adam Kahani. He's expert in scenario planning to try to discuss different scenarios in order to try to reach one that would be sort of acceptable by everybody. In that discussion, things emerged that are happening right now, very interesting. For example, if if you make a poll in the national police of many countries, would you be in favor of legalizing drugs? I haven't made it, but talking to the policemen in my country, many of them will say yes, because they know that the amount of effort that the police is making to try to fight an unwinnable war, they are the ones who are in the front line. In a recent meeting that we had of the commission, I was informed that we were informed that the Canadian Mountain Police, one of the most prestigious police in the world, supported a resolution calling for the legalization of marijuana, which is a very, very interesting aspect that I think we could approach more, because if the police start saying, listen, this is the way to go, this will facilitate and marginalize those populists that are defending the mano dura, as Andrés, the hardline approach, which has been probably one of the biggest obstacles in order to advance faster in this approach.
Thank you, Juan Manuel. Yes, President Dreifuss was saying that, it's big money. It is indeed. I was thinking as I listened to you that, 600 billion a year is twice the GDP of my country, Chile, in a whole year. That's a lot of money. Vanessa, back to you.
Thank you so much, Dean, and thanks for the clarification, President Santos, and thanks for all of your very thoughtful answers and approaches to this. Perhaps one thing that President Santos touched on, and I think that is quite relevant for what we should do next, for the next steps to perhaps thinking of a new system and a new international approach, is this precise fact that countries cannot do it alone. We are part of a global market. As Andrés mentioned, I am from Mexico. If we want to do a different policy approach, we need to do that in coordination with South America, with Central America, with the United States. We could not do it by ourselves. What are your thoughts about what are the next steps so we can actually have some changes in this international regime and a different approach and a different perspective, so that the rest in our national countries can follow? Thank you so much again for this great panel.
Anybody would like to take that?
Well, we debate a lot what would be the best way to get change. And at the global level, it's very difficult. You've had an unholy alliance of states which don't usually agree on anything much, but come together around repressive drug policies. And there's been a lineup of the US, China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the strange bedfellows, as it were. Now, maybe with the current moves in the US, there's a chance for something a little more rational. We've also, in the documents that we've issued from the Commission, talked about ways of moving where perhaps a group of countries could come together to propose inter se modifications of treaties which they would collaborate on. Increasingly, we see countries in a way thumbing their nose at the conventions, and saying, well, I'm legalizing cannabis because that's in the interests of my people. And, regardless of the visits they get from the International Narcotics Control Board telling them off. I think it would be wonderful if some consensus could be got through Central and Latin America about how to proceed. But again, there will be a range of views there too, including, when governments change. When the government changed in Colombia, the regime that followed President Santos was not, of course, as forward-leaning as he was on these issues. So I guess at the Commission, we really encourage countries to study what others are doing, begin looking at pragmatic reforms based on evidence of what works, and there's plenty of that around the world, in the hope that, you know, over time, like water dripping on a stone, there may be some change of heart at other levels, but I think there would have to be some profound changes of government in a range of countries for there to be, you know, significant movement at the global level. But other commissioners may like to chip in on this.
I think
Please.
you remember, Andrés, very well when we started globalization, the free trade agreements, and the concept of open regionalism. Some regions started to make free trade agreements among them. I think this is one of the approaches, not the only, but one of the approaches is precisely at a regional level. That could be a way to expand in order to go for the big prize, which is the global approach. But if you see many regions, look at what is happening right now. In the last month, with the former NAFTA, Canada, United States, and Mexico. Mexico just legalized marijuana. The Senate, they voted. Canada has marijuana legalized. And in the United States, we already have 15 states legalized. So in fact, what has been created is a big NAFTA for marijuana. And in Colombia, that produces the best marijuana in the world, has been left out. So we need to take advantage of that market, and we have to approach that as a business, regulated, and it's also a way. I'm just saying one of the ways that we can approach this problem. So by doing it in different steps simultaneously, I think is the most effective way to do it.
Spoken like a former finance minister, clearly. President Dreifuss, and then I'm going to move on to Q&A because we're running out of time, and there are a few questions that I'd really like to address.
Yes, I will be very, very brief. You were speaking about the first step, the next step. For me, the next step is really decriminalization of consumption and possession and self-production for their own use. And this is possible. I mean, the convention, the 88 convention ask for punishment, but it's also written in the convention that if the constitutional order or the law in the country is not punishing the consumption, this is accepted. So, I mean, there is no barrier, in my view, for a real decriminalization, and this must be the next step, in my view.
Very important words. Thank you, Madam President. We only have about 10 minutes left, but I want to make sure that we do get a few questions from the audience in. And I'm going to begin with a question from a member of parliament in the United Kingdom. Ronnie Cowan, member of parliament from Inverclyde, asks the following: as we try to move forward with this narrative, what value do you put on lived experience? I imagine he means, you know, accounts by people who've been in the middle of this debate or you know, have special weight and carry special relevance in trying to persuade other people to change, to reform. Anybody like to take a stab? Yes.
Yes, and thank you, Ronnie, for the question, because Ronnie has been a good supporter of the cause in Scotland, which, as I said, has the highest rate of drug-related deaths in Europe, which is shameful, and there are people working to change that. And one of the lived experiences which has come to the fore there is that of Peter Krykant, who is himself a former user and an injector of drugs. His life has changed, but he still has a deep feeling for those on the mean streets of Glasgow using unsafely as he once did. And he has started a harm reduction service, a drug consumption space in a mobile van, now a converted ambulance. And, initially the police ignored him. Then someone decided to, sort of harass what was happening. Then there was an arrest warrant. Now they've backed off. But it started a whole debate in Scotland about, we have these terrible figures. What are we going to do about it? Here's a guy with a lived experience who's out there doing something about it. Why would we stand in his way? So I think, the lived experience can be very powerful in promoting policy reform and change. And I really salute Ronnie and the others who've got in behind and supported that put into practice in Glasgow.
Very, very important point. What I've learned from my colleagues in the psychology department here at the LSE is that narratives that involve actual stories from human beings are the ones that really change minds. So Ronnie's point, I think, stands and is very important. Let me move to a question from Marzia Violini, who's an LSE alumni who lives in London. And I'm going to address this to President Motlanthe, if I may. She says the discourse on harm reduction up until now has divided drugs into illicit and legal, with tobacco, alcohol, and increasingly cannabis in the second category. But from everything that's been said so far in this panel, this separation would not seem to be warranted. So, Mr. President, how do we move into a world in which there's only one approach for regulating and treating all these substances, not two approaches as we have today?
Well, remember I said, bodies and organizations and governments have an immune system which tends to push our way new thinking. And so it is important to appreciate each step taken to open up the debate, because it is only through dialogue, once people debate the issue, once the issue is put out there for discussion, that at the end, this artificial separation will be eliminated. But for now, it represents a certain mindset that, the tendency, of all the psychoactive substances, none is more harmful than alcohol. And yet, society, broadly speaking, has come to accept that alcohol is legalized. And so through debates and discussion, it's possible to get to a consensus that, we shouldn't be introducing this artificial separation here.
Thank you, Mr. President. The separation is artificial indeed. As Prime Minister Clark said, it'd be terrible if, a glass of New Zealand Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc were to declare it illegal. Same holds, I suppose, for Chilean wine. We are in the competition for the same market and the same consumers. Let me read a couple questions more to the panel from our audience. And we have questions from people from all over the world. We have a question from Jaime Calle Moreno, who's a student here in London. but he's from Malaga, Spain. And he says crop substitution programs like the one Mr. Santos undertook in Colombia seem to have been very successful. Nonetheless, in other countries and in the current debate, such programs are either being ignored or pulled back. So what can we learn about crop substitution, and how do we make this a policy that is used elsewhere? I suppose the question is for President Santos, but if anybody else would like to come in on the broader experience elsewhere, that'd be great as well.
The key for successful crop substitution is to give the peasants that are growing the illegal drugs an alternative. As long as they don't have the income to feed their children, they will replant, they will maintain the illegal crops. This is an experience that we had. And when we started to give them an alternative, the replanting went down to almost zero. So this is a key aspect. And then another issue that I think that is very important in those medium or short-term goals is that the same approach that you cannot consider a consumer as a criminal. He's somebody who is sick. You cannot consider a peasant who is growing coca or marijuana as a criminal. How can you explain, and this happened to me, to a peasant who is growing marijuana, that he is going to jail, while in the state of Colorado in the United States, producing it, consuming it, and selling it is legal? These contradictions you have to do away with as soon as possible.
Yes, Madam President Dreifuss.
It's just to add that crop substitution needs a lot more than just finding another crop. It needs roads, it needs markets, it needs to desenclave whole regions. I mean, it's a development issue, it's not a farmer issue. And we see that, for instance, growing poppy or coca, I mean, it's worse to bring an airplane to take the crop and to bring it, I don't know where, in the lab where it will be transformed. This will not be done with potatoes. So, I mean, it's really, many promises were made to farmers and they went to be ruined and bankrupt because these proposals were not built on a viable economic business plan. So the response is a global development and not just crop replacement.
Thank you, Madam President. As I look at the clock, I think we may have time for maybe one more question. We're running out of time, but we have 3 Latin Americans on the call, so I suppose allowances will be made if we run over a minute or 2. The last question comes from Amin Grabi, who's an LSE student from Tunisia. And she says, in a developing country such as Tunisia and North Africa, law enforcement officials continue to entertain a very repressive approach. And the relationship with drug users and civil society remains conflictual. What's the advice on the ground for people who want to reform policy in countries like Tunisia? How do we move the debate? How do we move the attitudes of law enforcement officials, of politicians, of public opinion? We have 4 leaders on the call who've been doing that for the last few years or few decades even. What do we say to the student from Tunisia? What's good practical advice to move the debate forward in a country like hers? Anyone would like to take that?
Well, it's probably not so different from how you begin to mobilize from around policy change in any area, is it? Right. You need to find like-minded people. You need to identify elected officials and policymakers who may be open to hearing the arguments. You need to assemble the body of evidence. And I think the Global Commission on Drug Policy's website is a very good place to start, because all the evidence is there as to why the current regime doesn't make sense, and what might be able to be done. And then use the mechanisms you have in your society to advocate: the op-eds, the social media, the lobbying. I recognize that in many societies there isn't the kind of openness and civic space for this kind of advocacy to happen. But Tunisia did come through the uprisings in the Arab world with a substantially improved constitution, a democratic transition, and much more freedom of speech and civics and political space. So I say to Amira, I think it was from Tunisia, use that space to start creating the ground on which policy change might be built.
Thank you, Madam Prime Minister. Yes, Madam President, the floor is yours.
I'd like to ask something, because I am very touched by this question from this Tunisian student, because just a few days ago, Tunis has sentenced three young people to 3 years of jail for consuming cannabis. So, I mean, it's really a situation that is that shows that drug policy can be used to try to domestic, if I can say so, or to bring under control the use of a country, to bring under control those who might want to change the society. And this was also the beginning of the world war on drugs. You remember that one of the advisors of Nixon said, well, at the time when we introduced the war on drugs, we had two problems. We had the Black people, the Afro-American being rebellious, and we had the hippies being rebellious. But you cannot incarcerate somebody because he's a Black American or because he's a hippie. We can incarcerate them because they are consuming drugs. So this is also the drug policy repression is a tool that shows the fear that the authorities and the power has from the young people and from the marginalized people. So good luck to the student and to all the fellow of her in Tunisia. Use the means you have, and well, I'm sure it will change.
Thank you, Madam President. I think with those touching and wise words, we will put an end to the event. I want to thank everybody who's joined us today. I want to thank my colleague Vanessa Rubio from the School of Public Policy, who helped put this together. I also would like to thank the Global Commission on Drug Policy for co-sponsoring this event with us. And of course, to our 4 very distinguished panelists and guests. It is not every day that we get the privilege of chatting, discussing, and planning the future with 4 people who've led their countries, either heads of state or heads of government, and who also, and I want to say this from the heart, have had the courage to embrace a much needed policy reform, which, as President Santos said, is not always the most popular on the ground, but it is the right thing to do. And when one pursues the right thing to do long enough, ideally, it also becomes the popular thing to do. So President Dreifuss, Prime Minister Clark, President Motlanthe, President Santos, thank you very, very much. And to everyone who joined us, please come back to other event online at the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics. Thank you very, very much. Good afternoon, everyone.